Thank you, Derek. I don't profess to have the same, anything like the depth of knowledge about um, the domestic political situation in the Philippines as my colleagues who you've just heard from. But what I am interested in, what I've been researching for some time, is the ways in which Duterte has been represented in the Western media. So that's what I'm going to talk about now. Since 2016 and the election of Duterte, a relatively small number of Western authors and journalists have laudably tried to educate the largely blasé Western public about the Duterte regime, rightly drawing attention to its faux left populism, state authoritarianism, or we may as well just call it fascism, I think, cynical nationalism, toxic masculinity, and perhaps most appalling of all, its extrajudicial slaughter of narcotic suspects and political adversaries. However, this coverage is hampered by a good deal of confusion, hypocrisy, inaccuracy, and omission, in my view, not least because its exponents occupy points on a very narrow political spectrum, conservative at one extreme through to left liberal on the other, that is delimited and informed by neoliberal market forces. These include dwindling funds available for rigorous fourth estate reporting, especially of foreign affairs, the financial incentivizing of superficial clickbait and journalism content, and the sobering fact that in the US, just 15 billionaires with not particularly progressive political views, let's be honest, own almost the entire corporate media ecosystem. And in the UK, just 3 large companies own 83% of mainstream outlets. And it's going to be mostly about British and American journalists and other sorts of writers that I'm going to be talking about. When I say West, it's a somewhat homogenizing term, maybe. One of the consequences of this political economy of the media is that most so-called journals of note in the West offer partial, unreliable explanations for how Duterte's Philippines came to be. And their vocabulary is bereft of certain important factors that have already been alluded to by Walden and Oscar and others. Neoliberalism, US imperialism, then and now. And certain kind of Western ethnocentric ideas about not just the Philippines, but about the non-Western world. And let alone any awareness about the certain kinds of Western state corporate media biases towards the non-Western world, which are long-standing and you might say even legendary, but not for good reasons. The British Channel 4 News foreign correspondent Jonathan Miller's 2018 book, Duterte Harry, is an intensively researched blend of biography and reportage that provides a multi-fronted critique of Duterte's gruesome necropolitics and sociopathic personality. While to his credit, Miller acknowledges that poverty and inequality contributed to the popular disaffection that helped Duterte win the 2016 election, Miller's preference for a global trade system that disproportionately benefits Western economies as part of that sort of expression of that preference. He warns that Duterte challenges, I think it is a bit of an exaggeration this, but he warns that Duterte challenges the very stability of that international system, may explain why Miller does not address a key material cause of Dutertismo. As you know, Sir Walden said, who spoke earlier, he has asserted that in the 1980s and 90s, the US-dominated World Bank and IMF plunged the Philippines into extreme debt and massive poverty by imposing free market trade, industry, land, and spending reforms. Alienated from this economic and political order, swathes of Filipinos voted for Duterte's heady populism, and Walden gave you a kind of more detailed explanation of that particular historical context just now, so I won't sort of go on too much about that. But suffice to say, you won't read that in the sort of hegemonic Western media text that I'm talking about, and nor has there been any mainstream mention outside of one New Statesman article from May 2018 of the ways in which the West has more recently and directly aided Duterte's ascent. Over the last 4 years, the British government has approved £87 million worth of arms exports to the Philippines. This is some stats from the campaign against the arms trade. You can see some other relevant statistics that sort of tell us about Britain's sort of financial relationships with the Philippines when it comes to arms and weapons. From the sort of American perspective, President Joe Biden, hailed, I think, by over-optimistic centrists as a major improvement on Donald Trump, who of course got on famously with Duterte when he was in power, is in the process right now, if what we read is to be believed, of vending $2 billion worth of assault helicopters to the Duterte regime. By excising these economic and historical contexts, Miller and other Western writers' representations of Duterte as the aberrant bogeyman leader would seem to be misleading, if not hypocritical. Hypocrisy also distorts the moral calculus that Miller and others apply to Duterte's misdemeanors, encapsulated in Noam Chomsky's aphorism, "When they do it, it's a crime, when we do it, it's not." A May 2016 think piece in The Guardian makes the highly tendentious point that Duterte is more of a threat to the world than then US President Trump. While Duterte has slaughtered perhaps 30,000 Filipinos, he is incapable of attacking people beyond his own borders, whereas US military actions have killed up to 4 million in the Middle East alone since 1990. These actions have included, and people in a meeting like this will know this, these actions have included, and in some cases continue to include, the extrajudicial drone strike killings in Asia and North Africa, and of course the wars on Iraq and Afghanistan that made a mockery of international law and normalized torture and kidnapping. As you'll know, Duterte himself has lambasted such interventions. He's specifically named Libya, Panama, and Iraq in the press. You know, Miller, other writers like Jonathan M. Katz of The Atlantic magazine have rightly, I think, called Duterte out for whataboutism, or what is more formally termed the tu quoque fallacy, in which an argument consists in retorting a charge upon one's accuser. Duterte's ham-fisted strategy here is to cynically rebuff scrutiny of his own crimes by appealing to vulgar nationalism and anti-Americanism, as if the fact that Americans slang poor people all over the world somehow justifies him slaying poor people in his own country. However, attempts by Western liberals to level the tu quoque charge ring hollow due to their almost pathological inability to recognize that, as mentioned earlier, Western governments themselves have much more egregious records of violence. As the philosopher Andrew Spear argues, tu quoque can be used legitimately to question whether a particular moral principle is in fact one we endorse, and if so, whether everyone is consistently following it. And another issue on which Duterte has played the tu quoque card is the International Criminal Court, ICC's, investigation into him, which began in February 2018. While we should again seriously doubt the sincerity of Duterte's complaint, it does nonetheless speak to a pressing practical problem. How can Duterte and leaders like him in the post-colonial world, developing world, whatever you want to call it, be reasonably brought to justice when notable lawyers, academics, and UN officials even have repeatedly excoriated the ICC's erratic treatment of Western and non-Western state crimes? After examining the US's lack of liability for its actions in Vietnam, amongst other colonial wars, and stating that Western corporate impunity remains rife, the Secretary General of the European Centre for Constitutional and Human Rights, Wolfgang Kalleck, concludes that the practice of double standards will have to be addressed to protect the ICC against erosion of legitimacy and global endorsement. Needless to say, there is no consideration of the uneven moral landscape of international law in Miller's half-page disquisition on the ICC, nor in any of the dozens of reports on the topic by other Western pundits. It is not in their interests to raise the subject, for they would have to admit that the case against Duterte is in part driven by a conception of human rights, as so the Filipino historian Vicente Rafael holds, essentially a form of imperialism, the West dictating to the non-West the norms of proper conduct. These norms are particularly problematic, continues Rafael, because the UN rapporteurs are lecturing the Philippine president about human rights from a location that is historically responsible for their daily violation. When Michael Peel of the Financial Times argues that another reason for Duterte's success is his mining of a seam of anti-US sentiment, Peel only briefly and uncritically mentions acts of US imperialism that might have fueled this sentiment, Similarly, Miller remarks on a rich vein of unresolved colonial angst in Philippine society, but does not elaborate on the potential rationales for this angst. The Philippines was the Americans' first overseas colony, he writes nonchalantly, acquired from the Spanish after a short war in 1898 for $20 million US. His deployment of the euphemism acquired would lead the less informed reader to believe that the US conquest of the Philippines did not require the grisly racist genocide of the Philippine-American War. By contrast, the Filipino historian E. San Juan Jr., as well as other colleagues here, Oscar has sort of written about this too very eloquently, have pinpointed continuities between these US aggressions in the late Victorian period and its present-day counterinsurgency maneuvers against both Islamist and Maoist rebels around the archipelago. US troops are recolonizing the Philippines, writes San Juan Jr., to preserve its eroded world hegemony post-Cold War and post-9/11. Unfortunately, Miller is as ignorant of these latest abuses by the American empire as he is of those from 1898 to 1902, or even into the 1910s, if we talk about the full extent of the Philippine-American War. His only comment on such matters is US forces were operating in Mindanao in support of Philippine army operations against the jihadist Abu Sayyaf group. Miller's assessment is typical of observers bedazzled by the rhetoric of the romantic relationship, to use Neferti Tadiar's metaphor, between the US and the Philippines. Miller's claim that American military support for the Philippine state against a common enemy implies equal democratic partnership, as Tadiar would put it, but San Juan Jr.'s description gets closer to the material truth of the matter. The Philippines is yet another sovereign nation that the US is manipulating as a battlefront in the so-called war on terror. This Western media discourse imposes similarly discordant ethical principles on Duterte's pivot to China. The Guardian laments that surging Chinese investment in the Philippines and an apparent climb down by Duterte in a dispute with Beijing over territories in the South China Sea is tantamount to a surrender of the US alliance, not in the better interests of the Filipino people. But this case excludes some vital nuances. While it is true that Beijing has poured money into the Philippines, this does not mean Duterte has turned his back on the US, however anti-American his fustian can be. The US is erecting new military facilities in the archipelago and remains a more valuable trading partner to the Philippines than China, just about, if you look at this latest table of top trading partners according to the criterion of countries that imported the most Filipino shipments by dollar value during 2020. And at any rate, Duterte is not the first president to play what's been called a cat and mouse game of maintaining good relations with the US while improving relations with China. And again, my colleagues here would be much better equipped to me to talk about the sort of long history of Filipino leaders, Marcos in the 70s, signing a joint agreement with Beijing and other sort of overtures made to China while simultaneously trying to retain good relations with the US. Even supposing Western fears about realignment with China are well-founded, they are nevertheless predicated on a hypocritical assumption that China is a singular threat to Asian peace. Miller makes much of Beijing's remorseless militarization of the South China Sea while staying silent on the far larger and more provocative cordon of 400 American bases in countries surrounding China, some equipped with long-range missile capabilities. More to the point, unlike China, US armed forces are currently operating in 17 Asian countries, including the Philippines. While the official justification for this is once again the war on terror, Tadiar perceives the real agenda as the imposition of global martial law to ensure the obedience of crony states like the Philippines. Furthermore, as MGE Kelly avers, while we should be suspicious of Chinese pledges not to interfere in the internal affairs of other countries, by contrast, the US arrogates a right to global interference in almost everything. Apparently, it is not militarization of Southeast Asia per se that bothers Miller et al., just the Chinese militarization of Southeast Asia. So this new military and economics-based Sinophobia has redrawn the textual map of Manila too. A May 2018 Bloomberg News article offers a snapshot of the daily realities of Duterte's Faustian pact with China. Restaurants serving Chinese hot pots and dumplings and Mandarin broadcasts at the Mall of Asia are catering for 100,000 recent Chinese immigrants, according to this story, whose arrival in Manila has profited several local companies. However, in keeping with the hoary old cliche about Chinese avarice, which again people will know is long-standing, people like Carolyn Howe have written about this in great detail, long-standing within the Philippines, but it's also a kind of stereotype that exists beyond the Philippine context. This human deluge, which is the word this writer uses, has also contributed to soaring house prices, which is a source of worry for one Manileño at least. I hope they become an asset to the community, he says of these new Chinese arrivals, and not just out to make money. In a further signifier of problematic cupidity, the Bloomberg piece states that dozens of Chinese gambling operations are setting up shop in the city, producing a boom that won't last forever. It is instructive to compare this foreboding representation of Chinese investment with the celebratory tone of a 2013 BBC report on how innovative technology is driving Manila's amazing call centers and BPOs, business processing outsourcing concerns, that are contracted to British and American firms. Rather than, as per the Bloomberg story, highlighting the risks of this burgeoning sector, call centers are presented as an unalloyed success that are fully sustainable thanks to government tax breaks, fast-track permits, and other perks. Whereas Bloomberg paints the expatriate Chinese workers and business people as a deluge that is culturally reshaping Manila and stoking anxiety among its indigenes, no such concerns are raised by several recent media accounts of Western retail chains opening branches in Manila, for example. This one rule for the West, another rule for China discrepancy is conspicuous in Miller's work too. Swift to admonish Duterte's spending program for leaving the Philippines in debt bondage to China, his phrase, Miller has, as I mentioned earlier, nothing to say about the World Bank and IMF's crippling loans to the Philippines in the last stages of the 20th century. I think it's really important because I've had criticisms for this in the past. I really think it's important to assert that the criticisms I've just made of these sort of Western distortions, these Western mediations of the current Chinese-Philippine relations do not and should not suggest a contraposition that in any way exonerates Chinese exploitation of the Philippines. I think all forms of capitalist exploitation, imperial exploitation are wrong wherever, whether it's America or China or whoever else is practicing this. But that said, while there is certainly truth to the allegations that Duterte has sold out his country to Chinese interests, I think there's some truth in that. As with the tu quoque issue I mentioned earlier, when such allegations come from these Western observers, I don't think they can be taken all that seriously. So just to finish off then really, ultimately this discourse of misrepresentations that I've been talking about, I think speak to, and this kind of relates to what Joseph was saying, he said very briefly at the beginning of his talk about these sort of wider international dimensions that we have to understand in order to really appreciate Duterte's rise. And I think this discourse speaks to a sort of liberal, a Western liberal stroke neoliberal worldview that is in crisis. Though these writers castigate the Duterte regime for its brutality, and brutal it certainly is, they deny any Western responsibility for this totalitarian drift in Philippine politics. Nor do these critics accept that their own ideology, despite its ostensible support of human rights and rules-based international relations, that term always makes me want to laugh or cry, I don't know, perhaps simultaneously, because it's so ridiculous, has, as the Indian essayist Pankaj Mishra puts it, been an incubator for authoritarianisms, I know Oscar mentioned this earlier as well, across the post-colonial world, and advocated for the occupation and subjugation of other people's territory and culture as a wonderful instrument of civilization. All right, thank you for listening.